Hello, year 10. So here we are, lesson 4 of Macbeth, and today we'll be focusing on some more of the historical context, the backgrounds to some of the things that were happening around the time that Macbeth was written, which might have influenced some of the decisions that Shakespeare made regarding what went into the play. So here are our objectives. One, to understand the historical context Macbeth was written in, so we're going to find out a bit more about that, and then to recognise how that context has influenced the play. So, first part of the lesson is learning about the context. The second part of the lesson is you demonstrating that you understand, that you can recognise some of the ways this context has influenced the text Macbeth. So, straightforward objectives. If you want to make notes as we go along, you can do. And at the end of this video, there's a task for you to complete. Okay, guys, let's get started. Hey, attend. So, we're looking now at Shakespeare's monarchy, and there's four individuals on this slide who are important to understanding the context. We've got Henry VIII, Elizabeth I, Mary Queen of Scots, and James VI of Scotland. Now, the character that really matters for Macbeth is this guy here, James I of Scotland. He's the one who we need to really focus on, okay? Because he was king at the time Macbeth was written. The reason he was king, because this is James VI of Scotland, is because Elizabeth, here she is Elizabeth I, had no children, and due to the traditions of the royal family, the heir to the throne then has to kind of look back to the family tree to find the next legitimate heir, and it happened to be the King of Scotland at the time. So Henry VIII is Elizabeth's dad. Mary Queen of Scots is James VI of Scotland's mum. She was executed by Elizabeth I because um, she was a Catholic and had, Elizabeth was worried that the Catholic side of society would rally behind Mary Queen of Scots and create another civil war. The reason why the Catholics were seen as dangerous and a threat was because Henry VIII had broken away from the church, the Catholic Church, and the Pope in Rome by establishing the Church of England. So religion was really complicated at the time. If you were Church of England or Protestant, you were treated much more fairly, much more humanely than if you were Catholic. Now, Macbeth hasn't really got a lot of religion in it. You don't need to know much about the history of the Church of England and the arguments and the struggles and the wars against Catholic countries. What you do need to know is that James VI of Scotland was christened a Catholic, and that meant for the first time for a few generations, when he became James I of England, England had a Catholic king, and you can imagine that for many members of the Catholic faith, this was a moment of celebration and a moment of hope. And then at the same time, for members of the Church of England faith, it was a time of concern and possibly worry. And it was all based, on these different religious different versions of the same religion, Church of England versus Catholic. But what you need to know is that James I was the king at the time Macbeth was written, and it is no coincidence whatsoever that Shakespeare wrote a play about a Scottish king shortly after a Scottish king became King of England. So, James I of England. A few things on this slide here to show you. Right, so we'll start off in the top right hand corner with the Gunpowder Plot. Here we are. Okay. So James I of England, as we know, was born and christened a Catholic, which resulted in him being, for many Catholics, a source of hope. Catholics were being persecuted under the reign of Queen Elizabeth, and with her death and the arrival of James I, many Catholics thought that having a, a Catholic king, although he wasn't necessarily a practicing Catholic, he'd been brought up as a Protestant, but having someone who at least had a Catholic mother, the Catholics thought that James would be more sympathetic towards their particular cause. As it turns out, he was just as harsh on Catholics as previous monarchs, and that led to him being possibly even more hated by the Catholics in England, because they felt betrayed by him. So the hatred was really quite strong, and it led to a group of Catholics plotting together to find a way, or to devise a way, to assassinate him, and that was called the Gunpowder Plot. And the image there, we've got Guy Fawkes with a barrel of gunpowder underneath the House of Parliament, which the plan was to blow up the gunpowder underneath the building, which would cause the building to collapse and everyone inside the building to die. On the 5th of November, when it was meant to be detonated, James I would have been in that particular building. He would have been in the House of Parliament, and he would have died if the explosion had happened. So the story of Macbeth is about the assassination of a king. It's about a king being murdered, and then how Scotland kind of falls apart with kind of civil upheaval, with more deaths and more murders, until eventually the tyrant king who's cheated his way onto the throne gets killed himself, and the rightful heir is reinstated. So the play Macbeth is about the consequences of killing the king, and the kind of the aftermath and the upheaval and all the horrors that go with it. So in a way, Macbeth is a warning to conspirators who might want to get rid of James I that getting rid of the king does not necessarily bring about peace and tranquility and a better life. It can actually lead to a worse situation than you had before. Now, the coin, or what looks like a coin next to Guy Fawkes, is actually a medal, and that was given out by James I as a kind of reward. But the image on the back of the medal, as you can see there, is a snake surrounded by flowers, and that is a very important image to do with the play Macbeth, because when we look at a particular part of the play, the idea of being a flower, and also the serpent under it. So look like the flower, but be the serpent under it is the quote. That's a very important line in the play. So you could say from that line of being an innocent flower, but and the serpent under it, the direct reference to this medal, which is representing the Gunpowder Plot. So the idea of treason and murdering a king is definitely linked to James I's own actual personal history. The second thing to look at here in the kind of the James I kind of history side is the side of witches. Now, we know the witches are in Macbeth. We've already looked at them in that first scene, but it turns out, and you won't know this maybe, that James I was a real advocate for witch trials. He hated witches. He wants to get rid of all witches. He believed strongly in witches, and he felt that they were a real menace in society. His hatred came about from when he went to Denmark. He married a Danish member of the royal family, and when she was coming back to England to be with James, there was a terrible storm, and he blamed that bad weather on evil witches. And that opened up the opportunity for him to then start witch trials again. And one of the ways in which they identified witches was by reference to this particular text here, which is known as demonology, in form of a dialogue. And guess who wrote this book? But it is James I himself. So he wrote the book on witchcraft, as in how to spot a witch and how to get rid of one. So this document here was used in witch trials to accuse witches of women of being witches, and to help organise trials and tests to prove a woman was a witch or not. Lots and lots of witch trials occurred during his reign. Thousands of people were executed or died during those trials. And you could argue that he wasn't really interested in witches. That was all a bit of a bit of a cover, which enabled him and his close circle of allies to get rid of their enemies without much evidence. It was much easier to have a witch executed than a traitor, because if you wanted to have a traitor executed, you had to find evidence. Um, Getting a witch executed relied on very little evidence at all. Okay, so witchcraft and the accusation of witchcraft was very helpful for James to make sure he maintained power and kept a very tight control on things. The other two images here, the gentleman here who's got like on the war wounds, this is Banquo, and this image is from a fairly recent film adaptation of the story. The reason why I put Banquo on here is James I and Banquo are related. So, in terms of the play Macbeth, when you look at the characters, this play and the character Macbeth is not. James I and Macbeth are not the same character. James I is aligned with Banquo, and Banquo is a good guy. You know, Banquo is told that his sons will become kings, yet he doesn't do anything evil in the story. It's Macbeth that does all the evil stuff. So by having James I, who's the king of England at the time the play was performed, being related to the good guy in the story, that was going to make the king like the play more, like the production company more, and the playwright more. It's important at the time for Shakespeare to be on the good side of the king, because if the king didn't like your plays, he could shut down your theatre, and then you'd be out of business, and your career would be over. So Macbeth was an opportunity for Shakespeare to kind of ingratiate himself to James I in the hope that James I would then allow Shakespeare pretty much to continue to perform plays without any real problems or upheaval. And the final image is the Scottish flag. And of course, James I of England was James VI of Scotland. So by having a play set in Scotland, it's kind of, going to appeal to the king because it's like going back to his home country. So this idea of setting a play in Scotland is clearly part of the backstory to James I. It's where he grew up. It's where he had many happy memories. So Shakespeare is setting his play about a Scottish king at the same time that the Scottish king has become king of England. I think there's another side to this as well, though, and it's from the audience's point of view. The audience and the society at the time in England would not have been particularly keen on having a Scottish king coming out and taking over. So, by showing in this play Macbeth a really terrible Scottish king in the form of Macbeth, any comparisons to James I will make James I look better. So, in a way, this play, as a form of comparison between Macbeth and James, makes James look like the better king, which will boost his popularity a little bit and help him just establish himself in England. So, what I'm trying to draw your attention to here, really, in this slide, is that Shakespeare could be seen to basically have customized Macbeth to be almost like the perfect play for James I. It's got his favourite little hobby pastime of witchcraft in there, and the witches are shown to be evil, just like he likes to think of witches as evil. We are shown the dangers of plotting and assassinating a king and the terrible consequences that follow the country as it descends into tyranny and further war. So James is going to like that because that's a warning to anyone else that might try to assassinate him that, it's a daft idea. It's just going to cause more problems. James is going to love the character Banquo, who's shown to be a good, honest, noble character, and he's a relative of that particular individual. And finally, from the Scottish side of things, James is going to like any kind of Scottish art form or theme because it's going to remind him of home. And from the audience point of view, comparing James to Macbeth is going to make James look like the better king. How did this all kind of benefit Shakespeare? Well, after Macbeth was produced and performed, Shakespeare himself and his theatre company got a massive boost. James I liked the Macbeth production so much that he offered to sponsor Shakespeare's company for the rest of his life, and Shakespeare's company was rebranded as the King's Men, and basically that meant that Shakespeare was sponsored by the King, which was a very, very big deal at the time, and it meant that all his plays were pretty much guaranteed to be successful uh, for the rest of his life. So it was a really, really sensible business plan as well, Macbeth. It really helped Shakespeare as a writer, as a director, as a businessman to make a lot of money. So he gained financial stability because of the king's support. Now there is a final little note here as well to think about, going back to this idea of the Protestant versus the Catholic side of things. Shakespeare might have been worried about his family connections to Catholic faith and to Catholic conspirators. William Shakespeare's father was potentially an associate of some of the people involved in the Gunpowder Plot. So Shakespeare could have been worried that his family, particularly his father, could have been caught up in some of the aftermath and the consequences of the Gunpowder Plot, and by making this play so positive towards James I, Shakespeare might have been attempting to kind of prevent any of those accusations falling on himself and his father, because this play is such a positive text from James I's point of view. So it could have been an opportunity to save his father from being accused of being involved with Guy Fawkes in the Gunpowder Plot. Okay, now I think that's pretty much everything you need to know about James I and how his particular historical context connects to the play Macbeth. Okay, so your task for today, after watching all that information about James I and his connections with Macbeth, the play, I would like you to tackle this question. How did the play Macbeth appeal to King James I? Now you can answer this question in the form of a mini essay. If you're going to write a couple of paragraphs answering this question, that's fine, or the spider diagram. Now, I think there are 4 areas that I'd like in your answer here, so I would like that to be 4 paragraphs or 4 clear sections to your spider diagram. Now, if you need to go over the video again, please watch it again, pause it, take some notes, and then you'll be able to tackle this task. Okay, folks, thanks for listening today. I hope this has been okay for you, and I shall see you next time. Take care now.